Police had something in their evidence room, something they believed belonged to the man who killed a 9-year-old girl in 1964. But there was a problem. They didn't know who the man was. Not then. Not for decades. So the evidence stayed locked away. Year after year, detectives changed. Files stacked higher. The case slowly became unsolved in the way so many cases do. Not because it was forgotten, but because no one could move it forward. And then something changed. Something no one expected. A college student 20 years old looked at that same old evidence and saw something investigators had missed for nearly 60 years. Within weeks, a name finally appeared where there had been nothing but silence. A name tied to one of Pennsylvania's oldest child murder cases. But that answer didn't close the story. It opened something worse. Because the question wasn't just who did it anymore. It was this: how does a case stay unsolved for nearly 6 decades, when the answer was never truly gone? Before we continue, if you're drawn to real investigative cases like this, where old evidence, forgotten files, and modern science collide to reveal the truth, consider subscribing. We focus on real cold cases, how they happened, how they stalled, and how they were finally solved years later. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Hazleton, Pennsylvania, 1964, a coal town where life still moved at the speed of habit. People woke up early, worked long hours, and sent their children to school on the same streets they themselves had grown up on. Nothing about that morning looked unusual. No warning, no tension, no reason for anyone to think that the day would end differently from any other. And on one of those quiet streets, a 9-year-old girl stepped outside her home. She was carrying a small paper bag. Inside were canned goods for a school donation. It was a short walk. Familiar, routine, the kind of walk no parent would ever think twice about. She was expected at school. She never arrived. And by the time anyone realized she was missing, that ordinary morning had already turned into something the town would never forget. Marise did not arrive at school. The school contacted her family. Her family confirmed she had left home that morning. She was not where she was supposed to be. A search started immediately. Neighbors were asked. The route to school was checked. No one had seen her arrive. No one remembered her passing by. Police were called. The case was reported as a missing child. Officers arrived and took control of the search. They focused on the walking route between her home and school. It was short, familiar, heavily used by other children. Search teams checked the surrounding streets, backyards, alleys, nearby open areas. Nothing was found. No witness placed her at school. No witness confirmed she made the full trip. No witness saw what happened during the walk. The route produced no answers, no stopping point, no trace of where she had gone missing. By the end of the day, the situation was no longer treated as a simple missing report. Police continued the search through the night. The area was expanded. More units were called in. Still nothing was found. No sign of Marise on the streets. No confirmed sightings after she left home. The case moved from a missing child report into an active investigation, but there were still no leads, no suspects, no clear direction. Search teams expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Side streets were checked first, then surrounding blocks, then the wider area around the school route. Marise was not found. Police returned to her home route and rechecked it. Every turn was reviewed again. Every point along the walk was reconsidered. There was still no sign of where she had stopped. Officers spoke to residents along the path. They asked if anyone had seen a child that morning. No confirmed sightings were reported. The school confirmed she never arrived. Her absence could not be explained as delay or confusion. By now, the case was no longer treated as routine. Additional officers were assigned. The search area widened again. Nearby wooded areas were checked. Open lots were searched. Abandoned structures were inspected. Nothing was recovered. No clothing, no belongings, no witnesses who could place her after she left home. The investigation had a clear starting point, but no midpoint, and no endpoint. As the hours passed, the lack of evidence became its own problem. There was nowhere left in the immediate area that had not been checked at least once. Police began to treat the timeline as critical. They focused on narrowing the last confirmed moment she was seen. That moment remained unchanged. She left home that morning. Everything after that was unknown. Search efforts continued into the next phase. Volunteers joined the search. Local residents assisted police. The coverage area extended further outward. Still no trace of Marise was found. The absence of evidence now shifted the investigation. This was no longer just a missing child case with an unclear direction. It was becoming a case defined by what was not present. No sightings after departure, no physical evidence along the route, no indication of where the disappearance occurred. Police had a confirmed starting point, but nothing beyond it. Search efforts continued through the same day. Police and volunteers moved further from the original route. Areas near the walking path were checked again, then expanded outward into surrounding terrain. It was during this extended search that something was finally found. Marise was located. Her body was discovered not far from the general area of the search, close enough that the investigation immediately focused back on the original route, but hidden enough that it had not been seen during earlier passes. Police secured the area immediately. The search changed direction on the spot. Units that were still looking for a missing child were redirected to a crime scene. At that moment, the case changed classification. This was no longer a missing person investigation. It was a homicide investigation. The priority shifted instantly. The focus was no longer on where she had gone. It was on what had happened to her, and when, and by whom. The scene was processed by investigators. Evidence was collected. The area was examined carefully for any trace of what had led to the discovery, but answers did not come quickly. There was no obvious witness account tied directly to the location, no immediate suspect, no confirmed explanation for how she ended up there. What remained was the fact itself. A child had left home on a short walk. She had not reached her destination, and now she had been found. Police now had a confirmed death, but still no clear timeline of what happened between leaving home and the discovery. The investigation shifted again, from search operations to reconstruction. Detectives began working backward from the scene, trying to determine the sequence of events that led to that location. But the key problem remained unchanged. There was still no witness who saw what happened during the walk. No confirmed interaction, no direct account of the moment she disappeared. And so the case entered its next phase, a homicide investigation, with the victim identified, but no visible path connecting the beginning to the end. The discovery changed everything, but it did not answer anything. Police now had a confirmed homicide, a victim, a location, but no clear sequence of events leading to it. The first step was to reconstruct the timeline. Marise left home in the morning. She never arrived at school. Her body was found later the same day. That created a very narrow window, a short route, a short time frame, and no confirmed witnesses to what happened inside it. Investigators returned to the walking path. They focused on every point between her home and the school, looking for anything that could explain where the timeline broke. Nothing was found. No sign of struggle along the main route. No clear interruption reported by witnesses. No confirmed moment where she was seen off course. Police interviews continued. Residents along the route were questioned again. The same result repeated. No one could provide a definitive sighting after she left home. Attention shifted to the possibility that she had been taken off the main path early in the walk, but there was no direct evidence supporting where or how that could have happened. The investigation began to explore a new direction, whether the disappearance was random or targeted. But at this stage, There were no known links between Marise and any suspect. No prior threats, no known conflicts, no clear motive. The case remained defined by its most difficult problem: a very short distance, a very short time frame, and no visible point where the crime could be placed. Detectives now had to answer a more specific question: not just what happened to Marise, but how someone could commit the crime without leaving a trace along such a familiar route. And as the early investigation continued, the absence of answers became its own obstacle, because every direction they explored led back to the same point. Nothing had been seen. With no eyewitness accounts and no confirmed point of contact along the route, investigators shifted to people. Anyone who might have seen her, anyone who might have been in the area that morning, anyone whose behavior stood out after the disappearance. Police began conducting wider interviews across the neighborhood. They spoke to residents near the walking path again. They reviewed statements taken on the day of the disappearance. Nothing pointed to a clear suspect. There was no reported abduction, no vehicle description, no confirmed interaction between Marise and any adult that morning. The case file grew thicker, but not clearer. Each new interview added detail without direction. Investigators also reviewed whether Marise might have deviated from her normal route, but no evidence supported that theory. The path remained the only known line of movement, and that line still had no break that could be identified. At this stage, the investigation faced a critical limitation. There were no physical leads strong enough to identify a suspect, and no witness testimony strong enough to reconstruct the final moments of the walk. Police widened their scope further. They examined whether any unrelated incidents in the area that morning could be connected. Nothing established a link. The case began to rely heavily on elimination. What did not happen was becoming more certain than what did. No confirmed sightings, no confirmed suspect, no confirmed motive. And yet, the outcome remained undeniable. A child had left home. She had not reached school, and she had been found deceased within a short distance of that route. The investigation now reached a standstill point, not officially closed, but operationally limited. Because there was nothing new to pursue, the case file remained active, but progress depended on information that simply did not exist at the time. For investigators, the question was no longer just about identifying a suspect. It was about whether the case could ever be solved with the evidence available in 1964. And as the investigation slowed, the case began its transition into something different. A file that would remain open for decades, waiting for a method that did not yet exist. As weeks passed, the investigation slowed, not because it was closed, but because it stopped producing new information. All available leads had been followed, all known witnesses had been interviewed, all physical areas had been searched. Nothing changed. No suspect was identified, no arrest was made, no new evidence emerged. The case file remained open, but active progress stopped. Over time, detectives moved on to other investigations. Personnel changed. The original urgency faded, but the file stayed in the system. What remained was a record of what had been confirmed. A child left home. She never arrived at school. She was later found deceased. And no clear explanation was ever established for what happened in between. As years passed, the case became part of a larger category: unsolved homicide files, cases with confirmed outcomes, but incomplete answers. The evidence collected in 1964 was preserved, stored, maintained in case it would ever become useful again. But at the time, there was no method available that could move the investigation forward. No technology capable of extracting new identity information from what remained. So the case stayed where it was, unsolved, unchanged, unresolved. And for decades, that is where it remained. Decades passed. The case did not move, but it also did not disappear. The file remained in storage, preserved with the rest of the cold case records, still labeled unsolved, still unchanged. What investigators had in 1964 was limited to what could be collected at the time. They preserved what they could, but there was no way to extract more from it. Not then. As time went on, investigative methods changed. New tools appeared. New techniques were developed. But this case remained untouched for years. Because there was still no match, no suspect in the system, no confirmed identity to connect the evidence to. So the file stayed where it had always been, waiting. Eventually, something changed outside the case itself. Not in the investigation, but in science. A new approach to old evidence began to emerge, one that did not rely on eyewitnesses or direct leads, but on genetic information. Evidence that had once been static could now potentially be re-examined in a new way. The same material that had been collected decades earlier could now be analyzed with methods that did not exist in 1964. But for a long time, this case still remained inactive, because even with new technology available, there was no clear direction for where to begin. Then, years later, attention returned to old cold cases. Cases like this one, cases where evidence still existed, but answers did not. And this is where the investigation reached a turning point. Not yet a resolution, but the beginning of one. Because inside the file that had sat untouched for decades was something that could finally be re-examined. And this time, the evidence would not stay silent. The case file was pulled out again, not for review, but for re-examination. This time, investigators were not limited to the tools of 1964. They had access to modern DNA analysis methods. Evidence that had been stored for decades was submitted for testing. The goal was simple: see if anything could now be identified. What investigators had once treated as unexplainable was now treated as biological data. The results did not immediately produce a name, but they produced something else: a profile, a genetic profile that could be compared against modern databases. That profile was entered into a system designed to search for distant biological connections, not direct matches, but relatives, connections, patterns. And then, a lead appeared. Not a full identification, but a match strong enough to narrow the search. From that point, investigators began building a family line, tracing records, following genealogical connections, working backward through generations. And slowly, a name began to emerge, a possible suspect connected to the genetic profile. The investigation that had been silent for decades was now active again, but in a completely different form, no longer relying on eyewitnesses, or statements, or memory, now relying on biology and data. Eventually, investigators identified a man whose DNA aligned with the evidence from 1964, a connection that placed him within the scope of the case. For the first time in nearly 6 decades, the investigation had a direction. But before anything could be concluded, the question remained: how did this case stay unsolved for so long? When the answer had always been sitting in the evidence. For decades, the identity of Marise Chiverella's killer remained unknown. The case sat untouched, filed away as unsolved, until modern DNA testing reopened it. The evidence preserved from 1964 was finally analyzed with current technology. A full DNA profile was developed. That profile was run through genetic genealogy databases, not to find a direct match, but to find family connections, relatives, shared ancestry. Step by step, investigators built a family tree. They narrowed down possible individuals. One name kept appearing within the same genetic line. That name was James J. Andre Chuck. Investigators confirmed that his DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. The match was not partial, it was conclusive. At that point, There was no longer uncertainty about who was responsible. The investigation identified him as the perpetrator of the 1964 murder of Marise Ann Chiverella. But by the time the identification was made, Andrzejak had already died years earlier. There would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom testimony, but there was closure for investigators, and for a case that had remained open for nearly 60 years. A 9-year-old girl who walked a few blocks to school in 1964 finally had justice attached to her name. The case that once had no answers now had a confirmed suspect, a confirmed DNA match, and a resolved investigation. Case status: solved. Sometimes justice arrives quickly, sometimes it takes decades, and sometimes it only arrives when the science finally catches up to the evidence that was already there.